Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are enjoying your breakfast. Can we have a big round of applause for our students? They came in early today. All right. Now, without further ado, we're going to get our program started. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Scanlon and Dr. Jacqueline Aris. As you all are probably aware, Jim is the superintendent at the Westchester Area School District, and Jackie is the director of student services at the Chester County Intermediate Unit. And they are going to provide you with an overview of special education, including the legislation, litigation, and funding. Jackie?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have a few minutes to talk with everybody today about the special education journey that the state of Pennsylvania has been on for decades now. What I'd like to do is just give you a really brief overview of federal legislation that has affected special education, and then move into Pennsylvania state legislation that has affected special education. And then Dr. Scanlon is going to provide some additional information, specifically how some of this legislation has affected Westchester Area School District. So in federal legislation, the first real federal act that amended the Elementary and Secondary Act that affected special education happened in 1969. And it was with this act that the legislature actually defined learning disabilities for the first time. So they said, everybody in the country, you need to look for ways to identify students that have learning disabilities only, and then figure out how you can program for them. This quickly led to advocacy for other types of special needs students to enter school and to be provided with an education. So the next one happened in 1974, and that was the education amendments that said all children with disabilities have a right to go to school. What it didn't do was define what these students had to do once they were in school. So we now had students coming to school, and for the most part, it was up to individual states and individual school districts to make a determination about what they wanted or what they did or didn't do for students with disabilities. Really, the landmark case that most people are familiar with is Public Law 94-142, which is the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And it really came about because there was so much freedom allowed to individual states and school districts in what they could or should be doing for students with disabilities, that the federal legislation defined it. So they took this global concept of kids with disabilities will go to school now, and then they said, we're going to put some mandates in about what you have to do with these students as individual states. And of particular interest here is the word FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. So what the legislation said was that you will send each child to school, it will cost at no cost to the parents, and it must be appropriate for that student. So that word appropriate did more clearly define what states and school districts had to do, but there still was a very loose interpretation of appropriate. So some states took it one way, other states took it another way. In 1986, something slipped in the legislation that really didn't receive much press or much conversation, but it was actually a really landmark case, because it was in 1986 that federal legislation allowed parents to seek reimbursement of their legal fees that they had to spend in order to fight for an appropriate program for their parents. So it really didn't gain much momentum until the early 90s, when cases actually started getting settled by the court systems, and districts were being required to reimburse parents for their legal fees. So Individual with Disabilities Act came about in the 1990s. It further strengthened legislation because it said that school districts could now sue in federal court when they were dissatisfied with state rulings. And it also added a piece to legislation that hadn't previously been in, and that's the word transition planning. It's a small word, but it's a word that is attached to not only students, but to pretty high cost for school districts. The transition planning was the first legislation that was very clearly defined. It essentially said to school districts and to states that you're required to graduate students with disabilities in a way and in a manner that's going to ensure that they're successful adults. And that successful adults was defined as having a career or work opportunity, as having appropriate leisure skill development, and having a long-term living arrangement prior to graduation. After the IDEA, from the 90s to the 2000s, there was tons and tons of legal cases that helped define some of the language that was in the IDEA. Those legal cases had an impact on how the state of Pennsylvania started practicing special education. We can talk about that in a little bit. In 2000, the No Child Left Behind Act had a significant effect on special education because for the first time, we were required as states and as school districts to only implement practices in the core curriculum that were evidence-based and peer-reviewed. This had an impact because we could no longer piecemeal as special educators what we were doing for students. If we look at just one area, the area of literacy, we know a lot about literacy now. We knew a lot less in 2000. But now we have to have evidence-based reading practices being implemented for students with disabilities. They're great for students, and they are actually effective for students, but they do come at a high cost for school districts. Evidence-based reading practices could be a whole separate curriculum than what a district is already implementing in their school district for students with disabilities. So you have both curricular costs, you have training costs, and you have specialists that are then implementing those curriculums. Every Student Succeeds Act is where we are right now. And the exact implications, I think, are going to be unfolded over the next decade. And that has been traditional in most of the legislation that has happened. One of the major focuses of the Every Student Succeeds Act is on students with significant and complex needs. Prior to this time, we had a huge focus on students that had learning disabilities, emotional disabilities, life skills needs. This act is really asking you to look at students that have multiple disabilities and saying to you, instead of placing them in completely separate programs, how can you have a child with severe cognitive disabilities make meaningful progress in a least restrictive environment and with other peers? And if you are going to isolate the students because their needs are just that significant, it doesn't really, it doesn't take away the special educator's role to implement general curriculum with those students. So that obviously has a financial impact on school districts as well. What you're going to see on this one slide, and it really is just a brief overview, but what you're going to see is that Pennsylvania was actually doing all these things that were in federal legislation prior to them ever being implemented in federal legislation. If you look at the dates, in 1972, we had our landmark case in Pennsylvania, the Park Decree, which actually took about 15 years of federal legislation and put it into one act. So what took federal legislation to get 15 years through, Pennsylvania was doing in 1972. And that's things like already having IEPs and already having a free appropriate public education mandate. You'll see that Pennsylvania has led the way in special education practices. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is because Pennsylvania housed two of the main institutions that individuals with disabilities were living in. And when they became deinstitutionalized, Pennsylvania became the leader in trying to develop practices and programs that were going to be the most meaningful for individuals with disability. The other reason is because we've had state legislation that has trumped federal legislation. So we're always doing more than what federal legislation is. However, we're not receiving funding that balances the fact that we have more mandates than federal legislation. So Dr. Scanlon is going to talk a little bit about how federal legislation has fallen short, but Pennsylvania funding has also fallen short because the mandates keep coming and the funding source behind it is really almost entirely placed upon individual school districts. In 1991, there was a big change in the way Pennsylvania funded special education. Prior to that time, Pennsylvania funded 100% of the excess cost of Pennsylvania, or of special education. School districts relied on educational service agencies like IUs and other providers to provide many of the services for their special education students. Those educational service agencies and other providers would submit those costs to the state, and the state would reimburse. And it was reimbursed at 100%. In 1991, the state enacted legislation that said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. What we're going to do is have school districts create instructional support teams. This was the legislation that mandated that. And we're going to use these instructional support teams to hopefully prevent inappropriate referrals and inappropriate special education placements by stating to school districts, be real cautious about who you are referring and make sure that you're doing a lot before you refer. The first year it was actually effective. In 1991, the referral rate for special education dropped 48%. After that time period, there was no gains. At that time, school districts were promised funding for the instructional support teams. That funding never came through. So school districts who hired instructional support teams with an understanding that there'd be reimbursement never received that reimbursement. So it's another example of kind of mandates that school districts have had to pick up the cost for. Charter school the charter school legislation in '97 actually was favorable towards charter schools. They can receive state funding for 100% of their identified students. School districts are kind of capped at the 16% because the national average is 16% of students with disabilities exist in school districts. It's really just an average. So school districts that might have unique circumstances of why their special education rate is higher don't get credit for that in the current funding stream. We have the Act 1 index, which did allow school districts to seek tax increases to pay for special education. That comes with a lot of controversy, and it comes with a lot of regulations, which Jim has got an example for of just this school year. So that is not always an out for school districts. The new funding formula that was implemented in 2014 from the state of Pennsylvania essentially took the cost of special education and placed them into 3 buckets. And they gave school districts ranges of costs per student and said, kind of tell us how many students you have that cost this much, $0 to $15,000, how many cost over $15,000 to $35,000, and then over and above that. And then based on those costs, those buckets, there's some reimbursement given for new monies that are out there. Charter schools are not under that mandate, so they get the same reimbursement for all of their students no matter what the disability is. School districts are confined by those buckets. So before I turn it over to Dr. Scanlon, I just want to leave you with the idea that Pennsylvania is a leader in special education, something that I think we should all be really proud of. We know a lot. Other states come to us for information. We are heavy in the advocacy in Pennsylvania. That can be another great thing. But when it comes to actually enacting mandates and legislative action, we have a strong history of going above and beyond the federal legislation, and we have a strong history of not receiving funding for those mandates. So I thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Scanlon.
Good job, Jackie. Thank you very much. It's really important to know the history of special education. And Jackie mentioned 1991, which was really when things changed for funding sources in the state of Pennsylvania dramatically, and the financial cliff of funding special education began in 1991 when those excess costs were not reimbursed. That fell on school districts. I'll show you a graph in a minute as to what that's done since then, at least in Westchester. First of all, thank you to our legislators in Chester County for supporting our kids in public education. To the new legislators, I know we have a number of new people to the General Assembly this year. Congratulations. We look forward to working with you. We are very fortunate in Chester County to have outstanding public school systems in a state where we are really losing public school enrollment and total enrollment of students. A lot of people are heading south to the Sun Belt, and after this winter, I know I myself and many of my superintendent colleagues would love to be in Florida and be away from snow days. So a lot of families are heading that way into the Sun Belt. But we are one of the few counties in the state that is growing in terms of enrollment and families, and we're a very attractive place because of the support that we have for public education. So we thank you for all of that. As Jackie said, the federal promise to special education in the federal law was to be funded at 40%. And you can see by this graph, we've never really got there. We did get close in 2009, and that had to do with 2 years of funding with the AARA money that was emergency funds during the Great Recession that we went through. So there was more money coming from the federal government. That ended after 2 years, and you can see what happened. We went from 33% funding of special ed to about 16%, and we really have never gotten above that. When you look at the share of special education and the revenues and the funding sources that are taking place, when you look at the special education expenses as the green line, you can see what's happening with that green line. They keep going up. This is for the state of Pennsylvania. When you look at the blue, which is the state funding of special education, the blue bar, that has been relatively flat over many years. This is going back about 10 years. And if you look at the yellow bar that is on that bar graph, that is the federal contribution toward funding special education for the entire state of Pennsylvania. It doesn't take a mathematician to know that there is a big gap between the green and the bar, and that is what all the local school districts are paying in terms of funding their costs for special education. When you look at the expenses, how we're sharing some of these expenses, the red are the shared designated local districts for special education. Again, about 71%, 71.5% of the expenses are being shared locally by the local school districts in Pennsylvania, about 5.5% by the feds, and 23% by the state. So again, we are really not at that state and federal level of 40%. Most of the expenses and the cost sharing is happening at the local level at the expense of taxpayers. This is a more colorful graph for you. This is the Westchester Area School District. Going back to 1990-91. In 1990-91, we spent about $5.1 million on special education costs in our district. And that's at the far left of this graph. And about $2.2 million was shared by state and federal money. So we're doing pretty well. That's because that was the final year we could actually apply for the excess costs. So if we had an expensive student move into our district, or we had some kids that needed some additional resources, every district in Pennsylvania could apply to the State Department of Education for those excess costs, and it was covered. So Pennsylvania was, in fact, picking up the slack for the federal government in trying to fund special education costs. Once that ended, however, look what happens in the very next several years as the slope of this graph goes way up when you look at the blue graph. And by 17-18, we are now spending in excess of $44 million a year on special education costs. The red line is what the funding source has been from the state and federal. So you can see that was going up a little bit, and then by about 2010, that flattened off. That has really not increased for the past 8-9 years, but the expenses have gone up. And all of that blue shaded area, that's expense to local taxpayers in the Westchester Area School District. Now, Jackie mentioned that there's an exception. We can actually go apply for an exception to tax increases. In 2006, the General Assembly passed a law that capped the amount of taxes that school districts are allowed to impose on your communities. and there were some exceptions. By the way, in 2006, there were 10 exceptions. We are down to 2. They have been dwindled away. That's a topic for another day, but there's down to 2. Special ed's one of them. And it's only if you have excess costs. So last year in the Westchester Area School District, we worked very, very hard to kind of restructure some of our service delivery models to see if we could reduce some of the costs. That meant renegotiating some contract services with the IU and some of the other agencies. One of our big costs is litigation and attorney fees and payouts. That's a huge cost. The other one was our number of aides that we have. We have over 300 aides in our district working with some of our neediest special education students. We rewrote the way we provide aid service, not to just do one-on-one aids, but to do aid service for a couple reasons. One, it's hard to find aides anymore, and it's hard to keep them filled. And if you assign one person to an IEP, and we end up not having that person because they come a day, they work a day, a kid throws a chair at them, they quit the next day, we don't have an aide, we're now in violation of that IEP. We now go to a hearing, that's going to cost us $50,000 at the end of that hearing. Now it's a little more complicated than that, but that is the long and short of it. So we want to provide aid services, so if we don't have an aide, we can provide the service. So we saved some money doing that. We reduced our costs by about $800,000 looking at all of our services. What does that do for us in terms of our budget? It eliminated our Act 1 exception for special education costs because we don't have that excess cost this year. I will tell you that if I show you this graph next year, seeing what's happening this year now, the bar is going to start to creep up again because there is now, out on social media, there's a Facebook group that wants to file a class action suit against the Westchester Area School District because we're taking away their aides for their kids. We are not, but stay tuned, that could be some litigation that we're going to have for special education. We're trying to deliver the service the most cost-effective way that's good for kids. Here's what it does for taxpayers. When we look at our tax bills go out, and we are privileged, in our district, to have one of the lowest property taxes, and I think still the lowest rate. Great Valley's getting close, but I think we're still lower than Great Valley. Lowest tax rate, property tax rate in the county. But of that, in 1991, about $100 of the tax rate was what we used to help pay for special education. That's up to about $760 now as of 17-18. That our tax bill, just that part of the bill, goes to pay for special education services. And by the way, these graphs, any school district in Chester County could do a graph similar to this. All the slopes are going up. So when I do this for Westchester, I'm telling you, if you look at your own data, it will go up. I'm going to go through these quickly, Jackie. The complaints. This is how. So in this part of the state, we're privileged to be the leaders in the state in terms of litigation for special education. And we could go into, there's lots of reasons for it, but bottom line is most of the litigation that takes place is in the Philadelphia area and the 4 counties surrounding that. And these graphs will just kind of show you what are some of the disposition, due process, the complaints that we have compared to the United States. Pennsylvania is a little bit higher than the average. When you look at due processes by IUs and where are we with all of that, all other IUs are across the state are about 44%. Our IU and the ones in Delaware County, Bucks County, and Philadelphia, about 56% of all the cases are coming out of that section in the state of Pennsylvania. So again, we're privileged to be a place where lots of attorneys live. We have parents who have the finances to go ahead and do that, although they don't pay anything at the back end, because as Jackie already shared, in 1986, parents were able to collect attorney fees for filing due process, and that's when all of this began to escalate. Some of the outcomes in due process hearings, many of them get settled because school districts have to look at the cost benefit. What's it going to cost to go through a case and settle it, or to go fight the case and possibly lose? And I'll share a couple cases with you in just a minute. But about 62% get settled. Some are still active. Some are withdrawn. And only about 14% of these cases actually go to a decision where a hearing officer has to decide for the school district or for the parents and the parent's attorney. The decisions, when you go into a due process hearing, it's about 50-50, about 44 and 42% are decided where the LEA, which is the local education agency, that's the school district, the parents prevail in about 42% of these cases. Some where they both prevail, I'll share one of those with you in a minute. When they both prevail, cost the district a lot more than it costs the parents, because we end up paying the attorney fees for the parents, and that is that's money that's not going into the program for the kids, but into the pocket of the attorneys. And then again, about 4% get dismissed because there's not a case there. So when you go, and school boards have to decide, and administrators have to decide, if we're going, we have about a 50-50 chance to win a case if we go to due process. We have to weigh the cost benefit of that. Here are some key due process hearing cases that took place. I'm going to focus on the Ligonier Valley case in 2015. That was a case that when you went to a hearing prior to 2015, parents could actually go back if they won a hearing about the IEP for a student in their special ed cases. You could only go back to get what's called compensatory education back 2 years. This case allowed parents to go back in perpetuity, which means you can go back at the beginning of their instructional time, which for public schools begins at about the age of 3 when we start preschool programs. We're responsible to educate preschool programs. We do that through the intermediate units with the preschool education and IEP programs. We transition about 200 IEPs every year in Westchester coming out of the preschool programs into kindergarten. So you can go back in perpetuity with that case. And I'll share something about that. These are a couple of Supreme Court cases that are just recently taking place. One was service dogs and service dogs in schools. Many of our school districts in Chester County, I don't think this has a big impact on Chester County. Most of us have service dog policies, and certainly if kids need service dogs, we're making those accommodations. It does become a little tricky with kids with allergies, and you have to make sure you're addressing some of that as well. But I don't think that has a big a deal. Andrew F. case does have a little bit of an impact, because this case was one that was now defining what meaningful educational programs are, which has everybody looking at IEPs, and do your IEPs have this new definition of a meaningful program that's being defined by the courts, not being defined by the educators and the parents at the IEP meetings. So this one, I think, as we look down the road, will be the new set of litigation on IEPs, that parents will claim their IEP is not meaningful, and they're going to be using this case, which was a federal Supreme Court case that provided a new definition for what is meaningful, to provide that free and appropriate education. So what does all that mean for school districts? I'm going to give you some examples from the Westchester area school district. When you look at pendency, which also came out of a federal hearing, right? Federal court case, Supreme Court case. Pendency means that when there's a challenge to an IEP, that the parents are challenging the program that the school district is implementing. While you're going through the court process, the hearing process, you have to provide whatever program the child is in is the pendant program. You have to provide that program. You can't move the kid. You can't change it. You'd be accused of unilaterally changing the IEP. So pendency is you have to keep the kid where they are. Sounds simple, right? Makes sense. 4 years ago, we had a family move in from the state of California. And their child was in a 24-hour care facility, a mental health facility, and had been for 5 or 6 years. Parents were in Massachusetts. They were in a facility there. They moved to California. They moved to Westchester. And they say, we want our kid in a 24-hour facility. We said, we'd like to evaluate the kid. We think we can do a day treatment program and not have to pay the cost for a 24-hour care facility for mental health. Well, the parents said, we want to fight you on that. They couldn't believe we were challenging them on that. They said, nobody ever challenged them on this. And so we ended up having to pay that placement in California. It was about $200,000 a year for that placement while we fought the case. So we challenged that. We said we shouldn't have to go across state lines. We understand pendency, a school in Pennsylvania we shouldn't have to go across state lines to pay this. Some of our board members are here. You remember this case. We lost at the first level. Hearing officer said, no, you do. We went to the federal level. And at the federal level, the federal judge said, referred it back to the local hearing officer, said, you made a mistake. That is not what pendency really means. So we actually got that reversed, but that was one of those ties because parents were fighting us. We ended up having to pay all the attorney fees for the parent in that case. But we got the decision that, by the way, I think in school law courses, as you're learning about special ed law, the impact that that decision had an impact across the entire country, that school districts are not going to have to pay pendency external outside of your state. That was a big decision. Our board fought that, and we got that reversed at the federal level, but it cost us a lot of money in the process to do it, and it took about 3 years to do it. So I share that with you with some of the costs that we had to fight that, but I think it was an important fight. So you got to pick and choose your battles. Second case I'll give you, independent evaluation. This is one. Somebody moved into our, they're all move-ins too, by the way. They moved into our district. They were about 3 months in our schools, claiming that we weren't doing anything about kids being picked on. They wanted an independent evaluation done. We did an evaluation of the kids for a program. Our psychologist came up and decided that our program was appropriate. We did not want to pay for another independent evaluation. We felt like our psychological reports were solid. And so we go to a hearing about all of that. Hearing officer says, no, you should do the independent evaluation. You should do that, pay for it. We looked at the evaluation. Hearing officer agreed that that evaluation that the parents had was the same thing that we had. So there was really nothing new to it. But because we lost that piece, it cost us $50,000 in attorney fees because to look at an evaluation that said basically the same thing that our evaluation did. Parents then sued us for the private school tuition. We fought that. We won that case where the hearing officer said you do not have to pay the private school tuition, but you did have to look at the independent evaluation. So through all of that, we had those kids for 3 months. They are now in a private school. They sued us for tuition. We're not paying the tuition, but we did pay their attorneys $50,000 to do that. That was that one. Student C, this is one when you go back to that Ligonier case in 2015, when you talk about compensatory education going back more than 2 years. This is a case, we had a student at one of our high schools, was accepted to 10 colleges, had an IEP during the high school years. We did a lot of accommodations for this student all through elementary and middle school, which I think is the way to go to try to give kids those supports before you label them. I think the bar gets lowered a little bit once you label them. But anyhow, they had an IEP in high school, applied to 10 colleges, got into all 10 colleges. Parents said, they sue us because they said you should have identified this student earlier. Was struggling in 4th grade. We told you about it, even though there was progress being made by the student. This became a child find issue. And a child find issue means that you've got to identify these children as soon as possible, give them an IEP, and then move them ahead. Well, this kid was very successful. We fought it. We lost. The hearing officer said no, even though the kid got into all 10 colleges. By the way, that kid is in college now. You should have identified the kid in 4th grade. Therefore, you owe compensatory ed for $85,000 plus the attorney fees. And that's what that case meant. Even though we demonstrated success of this kid, it didn't matter because the law said you had to go do that. So as superintendents and as special education staff and instructors in all of our schools, we always have to evaluate not if we're going to be sued in special ed, but when. Do you want to fight it at the front end? Because if we identify somebody too soon, parents sue us and say you're identifying my kid too soon. If we wait till later, parents will say you should have identified them earlier. So we kind of pick and choose which battle we're going to fight. It's happening all over, and it's because of the reimbursement of legal fees, there are attorneys out there that are actually running workshops for parents on how to sue your school district for your private school tuition. And they're doing it through special ed law. In fact, I signed up for one of them, and when they saw my name on the list, they canceled the workshop because they knew I was a superintendent of the Westchester Area School District. I'll send my wife. She has a different last name. She's going to go to the next workshop. But so I give you a couple examples as to what's happening. All of our school districts can share stories like that with you. Some final thoughts about special education. Federally, districts have not been funded since Public Law 94-142 went in 1974, IDEA in the early 90s. It gets reevaluated every 5 years. All federal law is supposed to. Has not been funded to the 40%. Pennsylvania, by the way, this is something that our Pennsylvania legislators can work on. We have our regulations. Even though there's one federal law, there are 50 versions of it across the country because each state has to set their own regulations to meet the federal law. Pennsylvania standards, as Jackie said, we've been doing this before it was federal law. That's a good thing. But the Pennsylvania standards go beyond some of the federal regulations and federal law. That's something that maybe we can take a look at in our General Assembly. The Supreme Court cases have really not helped public schools, has really empowered attorneys. There's a whole new jobs being created with suing school districts. So some of these cases have had an impact. State and funding formula, that's increased over costs. When you talk about, and we're going to talk about the cyber school funding, special ed is driving up those costs an awful lot. And so that actually jumps into some of the charter school funding. And these attorney fees are really increasing the local costs for school districts. So what are some things our legislators can do? Take a look at the federal level. We need to keep working on the 40%. I know this is a broken record. It's going over and over. I've been speaking out since the mid-90s about special education funding formula, and I feel like we keep preaching to the choir, but maybe one day it's going to happen, and we need to keep fighting for that. I think we ought to look at something on these cap for attorney fees. We pay our attorneys anywhere between $165 and $200 an hour, and we are paying attorney fees in excess of $600 an hour for parents, and they're both going to the same hearings and doing the same prep work. So there are no limits on that. That might be something that is worth pursuing, even though it doesn't eliminate the attorney fee cost. I think it's something we should look at and put some caps on attorney fees or limits as to how much can be spent. And obviously no new mandates. One of the things that I find as new legislators come on, you guys have a terrible job. You got to answer to everybody. There's never enough money to do what everybody wants to do. We get it. We understand that. We deal with that in all of our school districts as well. But when someone's complaining about something, what tends to happen, and we've seen this over and over and over many, many decades of legislative change, one piece gets fixed in isolation. I think it's important to know the history. I think it's important to look at the big picture as to what that one piece is going to do down the road. And I think involving educators who have been living and breathing this stuff will be helpful and beneficial to making better decisions about good legislation that is not done just in isolation, but really looking at the big picture that's better for kids. Some of the state level pieces, again, look at some of those federal mandates. Do we need to go above and beyond that? The charter school funding formula, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. And just if we can reduce mandates, give us some flexibility, we think we can try to make the dollars go a little bit farther. So we thank you for listening and hearing the broken record over again, but I'm always hopeful that someday we're going to make some headway into just trying to get some controls on some of the special education costs. We want to help kids. We do a great job. In Chester County, we are victims of our own success. People move here for the special ed services, but understand if they move here in January and our budgets are already passed and they have a $200,000 IEP that we have to implement, we can't say no. We have to find $200,000 and implement that IEP. And we know that at the back end, we can't apply for that excess cost from the state. You can do some of it, but only up to $150,000 per district per year. So there is limits to that as well. So thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you.
have a round of applause for Jim and Jackie? Thank you very much. I have to do a quick switch here. Let's see if my computer skills will work, or if I'm going to have to call. Okay. Did I do it? I did it. Christy, I don't need you right now. I always need you like in the long term. So I'm just going to go over some areas on cyber charter school costs, which are really impacting not only Chester County but the entire state. But since we are in Chester County, we're going to take a look at this. So why it's becoming a problem. I have too much nervous energy to stand behind a podium. Why it's becoming a problem. If you look at this chart, since the last about 5 years, look at the costs of cyber education. It's gone up between 30 and 33%, the tuition rate. We here at the intermediate unit run a similar program. Our program has gone up about 2% a year, or the Act 1 index. So again, we're bound by the Act 1 index, and cyber charter schools are not. Okay, so if we look at that, it's a little askew, but on charter schools in Chester County, taxpayers pay $86 million. Over $86 million go to charter schools in Pennsylvania, in Chester County alone. 70 to brick and mortar, and another 16 million to our cyber charter schools. Okay, so what does that really look like, and how can we kind of reduce that? So here's a little pop quiz. You have John Doe, he's in 9th grade, or he's a regular education kid. If we were to educate him in cyber programs that both the Avon Grove School District and Great Valley School District run, it would cost those districts just about $5,100. And that includes laptops, internet reimbursement, and online course for 6 courses. That same kid will cost, in a cyber charter school, almost $11,000 if they're in the Avon Grove School District, and almost $16,000 if they're in the Great Valley School District. I picked those two because they're at the ends in Chester County, right? So that's the minimum tuition payment in Avon Grove, and that's the maximum in Great Valley. So if they're running their own program, they save about $6,000 per student in the Avon Grove School District, and about $10,500 in the Great Valley School District. So we've been talking a lot about special ed. What about special ed? So Jackie talked about the tiers, right? Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Here's the impact of special education funding not going through the formula for charter schools. So the IU, we have a student, he has an IEP. He requires small class size, one-on-one with staff members, extended time to complete assignments without penalty, positive written verbal praise, and problem-solving supports and breaks. So in a cyber environment, many of these accommodations happen naturally, right? You can take time, you can take breaks, all your work is done one-on-one. So if we use this same formula, and this is an actual student and an actual cost, it will cost $5,200 if you ran that student in the district programs. In the Avon Grove Cyber Charter School, they'll pay $25,000 to send that child to a cyber charter school. And in the Great Valley School District, they'll pay about $40,000 to send that student to a cyber charter school. If you look at the difference, savings per student are $20,000 for the Avon Grove District and $35,000 for the Great Valley School District for running their own programs, which they do. We have a student has more significant needs, also requires an hour of counseling per week and an hour of physical therapy. And there you can see, by running their own programs, the district saves $16,000 or $30,000. That's the cost differentiation. It is the same student. So if we look at that, what can we do? So in our program, we run typically about 1,300 students now, and that results in almost a $10 million savings. But that doesn't account for all the students that are still in cyber charter schools. So what can our legislators do to help us? They can fund special education at the promised 40%, no new mandates, no education savings accounts. At the state level, we need you to support Senate Bill 34 and House Bill 526. Those two bills say that if a school district runs its own cyber program, they will not have to pay the tuition to a cyber school. That would greatly, greatly help our school districts. If you can't do that, apply the special education funding formula to charter schools and cyber charter schools specifically. The needs of the students tend to be in the tier 1 and tier 2, and rarely in the tier 3 in a cyber charter school. And yet, they're getting money for every student at the top rate. Also, set a standard statewide cyber charter school tuition that reflects the actual costs. Here at the intermediate unit, we can run a cyber charter school program that has all the bells and whistles, laptop tuition reimbursement for about $5,100 a student. Even if you take into account that we would have some infrastructure costs that are already built in that maybe a cyber school wouldn't, the number still does not approach $10,000 or $15,000 per student, and it's coming from throughout the state. So those are our thoughts here. We would now like to invite you to take some time and discuss them at the table with your legislators on ways we can support. And I have a question. I think that's a great question to have at your tables with your legislators. There is a brochure at your desk, and that shows the scores of the cyber schools throughout the state. Fun fact about Chester County: we have the dubious distinction of having the third largest amount of charter schools within our borders. We are second only to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And our schools are regularly recognized in outside sources as amongst the best in the nation and the state. So, yeah, public schools. Yes, public schools, yeah. All right. So if you want to take about 10 or 15 minutes to discuss what we've talked about in special ed, cyber, and any other areas that you would like to address. And then we will conclude and ask our legislators to give us some of their thoughts. Hello, everyone. I know there's a lot of good discussion going on at the tables, but it's about 10:15. So I would now first I want to know who solved all the problems. You can go first. Okay. So I want to give our state legislators who have been listening to us a chance to reflect on what they've heard and maybe some solutions that are currently being worked on in this new legislative session. We don't have a wireless mic, so I'm going to have to invite you to come up here. So I'm going to start with Senator Dinniman.
I do understand the problems that you have mentioned and spoken about, and I think if with a little bit of luck, we'll see some action on the cyber charter schools now in this session. I mean, the main bill that you put on the slide would set a statewide tuition rate, and that would be of great help. But understand the power that the charter school community has politically. The amount of money they give to certain candidates, and because remember, while they're technically nonprofit, they are owned by companies that make a profit, all right? The other aspect of this, so with that in mind, I believe in, and my friend Representative Lawrence and Karen Committee and the others from the House who I see here can talk more about Representative Sawney's bill, and I think it'll come out of the House rather than the Senate if we get a comprehensive proposal. But I am putting in 2 sub-bills because I fear that the main bill might not make it, okay? And the first sub-bill is this. Well, there's actually 3 sub-bills. One is to extend the 3-tier system to charter schools, especially cyber charter schools, okay? And their power is shown by the fact that they were left out, right? The second is, if the main bill doesn't work and I don't see enough support on the second bill, the third approach, which I think is one we can actually get, is to say that the determination as to the level of tier of that student, tier 1, 2, or 3, is going to be made by the local school district. The advantage of that is when the student goes to the cyber charter school, that level is maintained, all right? And the reason I think we have a shot at this is because we are labeling young people. And that's a serious matter. And so just as you have emotion and feelings attached to advocacy, justifiably, you know what I mean, everyone's going to care about their child and work to get the best for their child. You also have the same theme, if you think about it for a second, in terms of labeling a young person. Because, that label is going to be maintained throughout their career. So hopefully we will be able to get that through. It costs you a little more money, but in the end it's going to be far less. And by the way, it's fairer. It means that the same criteria that you used, I see my friend from Phoenixville, that you used in Phoenixville, would also apply to Renaissance Charter School or the Chester County 21st Century School. So there's a consistency, a fairness, and we don't misplace someone and just to get more money by upping what they have. And finally, the third alternative is to really try to put a cap, and that could be done on the state basis, finally put a cap in terms of these, in terms of the lawyer fees. And there's nothing to say we can't. And the interesting thing about that is try to associate it with tort reform, if I may say, because the majority party is very strong on trying to get tort reform in terms of the costs of legal cases. If you now put it into the category where they feel this way, I think we can succeed. The whole part of Harrisburg is we try to reach a consensus, we try to bring people together, you try to figure out what everyone's interest is and move. And finally, and the very last thing is this, understand everything is local, all right? So as you go out, and Regina is going to help me with this, if I know and everyone here knows its impact on each local district, you see, then you win people over. Because your statewide associations and others will tell us the impact and Department of Education on the whole. But to win the legislator around, he or she has to know what it means in their district. You see what I'm saying? So the more you can localize it. And finally, let me wish Chuck Linderman back there, 38 years, Chuck. 4 more days to go. So let's give him a good round of applause. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Senator. We'll stay in the Senate chamber, and we'll invite up Senator Carney.
Thank you very much. I'm relatively new to this. I'm in my 3rd month in the Senate. It's quite an educational process, as you might think. I'm perhaps naive enough to think that we can make the cyber charter thing work this year. There's an inescapable logic to it that can really go across the aisle on both sides. And I think that's our biggest push at this point. I also like to point out that I'm the only state senator who has 2 congresswomen who are my constituents, so we're going to be working with them to push on the funding for special education, because that's something, again, where I think the timing is right for us now at this point to try to make these things happen. The Senate is a very interesting place where the numbers are getting closer and closer, seemingly on a monthly basis, one thing I can tell you I've learned is that I've already conceded that being in the majority would make a huge difference in the way we can actually make things happen, particularly on education funding and trying to move things forward. So thank you very much. I appreciate being here. I appreciate the program. And thanks for, I only have a little bit of Chester County, but I still like to keep my hand in. So thanks very much.
Thank you. We're going to move over to the House now with Representative Lawrence. I'd like to thank Representative Lawrence. He was very instrumental in helping us getting 2 DMV testing centers in Chester County. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning, and I appreciate particularly the board members who've taken the time to be here this morning. I appreciate the good work you do. My feelings are that, frankly, school board members have a thankless job. There's a lot of long meetings, a lot of long hours. No matter what you decide, everyone hates you. And, it's far too underappreciated, just to be honest with you. And the pay, right? The pay is great, right? So I appreciate your service. We covered a lot of territory this morning with regard to the legislation. I would concur with some of the thoughts shared earlier, particularly, where I saw Senator Dinniman back there, but at any rate, the legislation with regard to cyber charters and charter school offerings at a home district has been introduced by Representative Kurt Sonny, who's from Erie, and he's introduced that legislation for the last few sessions, and this session is the chair of the Education Committee. So it would stand to reason that he would be interested in moving his own legislation, so we'll see where that goes. I serve on appropriations. We just got done with appropriations hearings in the House and the Senate. We had the opportunity to question the Secretary of Education and the Executive Director for SERS and PSERS. My questions focusing on to the Executive Director of SERS, I think everybody in this room particularly appreciates the tremendous elephant in the room, which is the vast underfunding to PSERS and SERS, the 2 pension systems in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. These are vastly underfunded, not because the teachers did anything wrong. They've put in every nickel they were ever asked to put in. It was the state that shirked its responsibility, particularly under the Ridge and Rendell administrations. To put it into perspective, I was sharing at my table, out of a $32 billion budget, state budget last year, $2.4 billion, or about 1 out of $15 the state spent last year, went to PEASers. Now, to put that into perspective, that's as much as was put in during the entire 8 years of the Rendell administration. So that massive shortfall in funding hits both the state and the districts very hard, right? You're putting 35% of payroll into PEASers. The calendar year for PEASers works on a July to June, so we don't have the numbers yet for this year because we haven't gotten to June yet. But CSRS last year lost 4% on their investment, the bucket of investments they have. Now, their anticipated rate of annual return is 7%, but they lost 4%. That move right there. Also for CSRS, think about this. This is state employees now I'm talking about. For CSRS, think about this. They brought in $2.6 billion in contributions from employees in the state and paid out $3.4 billion to annuitants. So CSRS paid out $800 million more last year than they brought in. That's on top of a $3 billion investment loss. So as we look at these tremendous challenges we are facing, we must keep the promises we've made to our teachers and our state workers. It is a tremendous issue facing Harrisburg, and it filters down obviously as well to the districts. Those of you who've been on the board for a long time remember a time when the districts were putting 5-6% of payroll into PEASers. So on that happy, cheerful note, I again appreciate all your time this morning and the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Howard, who has the longest walk up here.
Thank you. So what I want to share with you is before this current job, I was a child abuse investigator for this county's children, youth, and families. So I had the opportunity to meet a lot of students who are enrolled in cyber charter schools, including a young man who managed to make himself truant from his cyber charter school by not logging in and doing his work. Significant mental health issues in this family, and I definitely saw a total lack of oversight of cyber charter and a total lack of education or services provided to this young man. Fortunately, he came to the realization himself that he would do better by actually attending school and being in a supportive environment. I fully support any funding we have to put into public schools. In my work as a child abuse investigator, I saw that the public schools were the safe haven for many of our children who lived at home in dangerous, unsafe situations, and that their ability to go to school during the day and be in a safe and warm environment with supportive people who cared about their future, who fed them, is something we cannot fail to fund. So thank you.
Thank you. Representative Comita?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I feel right at home here. I taught in the Octorara School District for 12 years, right out of Westchester State College at the time. And I'm a product of our public schools from not kindergarten, because there was no kindergarten in public school at the time, but first grade right through college as an alum of Westchester. So my colleagues have touched on, a lot of the legislative fixes and, tasks at hand. And I will just say a couple of things. One, I'm always looking for fixes that are not legislative, because a lot of good ideas get stuck in the legislature and don't go anywhere. So at my table, we came up with a couple of things, and Kate Shaw's and I are going to talk about it later, and we're going to see, but basically talking about holding charter schools accountable and making sure that those that are not educating our children the way they should be are held accountable, closed, or otherwise dealt with. So I thought I would just share something. Today is the climate strike, right? The global climate strike. So, and the nexus between the global climate strike and education is that there are kids across the globe, including in Westchester, who may leave school a little bit early as an act of civil disobedience to stand up for fighting the climate crisis. I am not an advocate of young people leaving school as an act of civil disobedience, but I do understand their passion and I support their mission. So driving over here this morning, the head of the U.S. Climate strike team said that their goal, is to get older generations to take action. Well, that is exactly what we're talking about with education. And education and the climate crisis, I believe, are really the two top issues of our time. And as adults, our number one job is to protect and nurture our children. Education and making sure they have a healthy world to inherit are two things that go hand in hand. So I just want to give a shout out to the students who are helping push the adults to do what we should be doing anyway. And I want to thank everyone who's working hard to nurture and educate our children, and I'm proud to work together with everyone. I'm with you 100%, so let me know anything I can do along the way. Thank you.
All right, I think there were some other legislators, but they needed to leave a little bit early, so I think that now leaves just me to call up last but not least, my boss, Dr. Joseph O'Brien.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, last but not least, we've been giving a lot of rounds of applause to our legislators and to folks who are here. Could we please have a round of applause for Mary Curley and her staff, because it's another great job. And to our legislative friends, thank you for coming. You know, we hope we didn't beat you up too badly, you know, at the tables, but we're all passionate about education. Everyone in this room has a deep commitment to that. You know, we're former teachers, we're school board members. I like what Representative Lawrence said. You know, think of the pay the school board members get, and think of the abuse that you get. You know, you get no pay and lots of abuse because you're trying to do something good, something to do better society. That's what it's all about. Representative Committee talked about the young people today with climate change, trying to improve society. So I thank everybody for being here today. We're really proud to put this on. I do want to say that we hope that you'll take a look at the PowerPoint, and anyone who wants a copy of the PowerPoint should just let us know, and we'll make sure we get it to you. Let's spread that around. There's a certain irresistible logic to the arguments in that PowerPoint that make it difficult for legislators, when they're confronted with that logic, to say, yeah, let's continue to overfund cyber charter schools. It just doesn't make sense once they understand. We're educators. Our goal is to educate. Today, we're trying to educate our legislative staff. What you can do on special education costs is also pretty simple. Let's not pay parents' attorneys more than we pay our attorneys. They're at the same hearings. Let's put a cap on it. This is your taxpayers' money. There's nothing wrong with putting a cap on how much we spend taxpayers' money. That kind of action will have a pyramid, you know, a spiraling effect, just as the previous poor action, where we allowed that to happen, had a negative effect. You cap it, you'll have less lawyers going out there client hunting because it won't be as lucrative a field. Let's just use some good common sense logic and help us out. Don't pass any mandates more than what we have. Our hands are tied now. You heard Jim, I thought, did a great job of explaining some of the terrible situations that superintendents and school districts and school board members find themselves in. I wish I had $1 for every frustrated school board member I would have who would look at me and say, Joe, this has to stop. This is ridiculous. What, you know, why are we doing this? And you shrug your shoulders and you say, It's the law. You know, we have to do it. It's a Hobson's choice. Pay me now, pay me later. Choose when to fight, because you're not able to not fight. So that's all we're asking. Please educate everyone you can. Share that PowerPoint. Support legislation that comes in front of you that has good common sense items. And last but not least, thank you for coming. We have great legislative relationships here in Chester County. We love our legislators. You represent us. We know you care about us. So we thank you and we care about you back. Have a great day. Thanks for coming.